Pope Francis passing away at the age of 88. News coming through from the Vatican earlier this morning. He had been hospitalized a few weeks ago, you might remember, after having a few complications and then contracting pneumonia. And now news, of course, emerging that he's passed away while at his residence on this Easter Monday. And I mentioned earlier today that there's, I suppose, a bit of poetry in all of that, given just how solemn the past couple of days have been for many of the faithful who have gathered on what you're seeing there on your screen, which is St. Peter's Basilica, the seat of the church is what it's referred to. That, of course, is in Rome, in the Vatican. In fact, the Pope was seen just yesterday on the balcony there that's in frame, and there had been thousands of people who have gathered to at least catch a glimpse of him, many of them clutching onto their rosaries and bringing flowers in order to essentially send up prayers and supplications for his full recovery. But news emerging now, of course, that at around 7:35 this morning, Pope Francis, it seemed, breathed his last, as it were. And as I mentioned, it came just fewer than 24 hours after he made an appearance at St. Peter's Square. In fact, he came out in a wheelchair. He waved from the balcony of the Basilica to cheering crowds, where he said, something along the lines of, "Dear brothers and sisters, happy Easter," a very short message, given his ill health. Following that blessing, he was actually driven around the square itself. He passed through some of the crowds. There was a procession that paused for a short moment a number of times as the Pope interacted specifically with babies in order to offer his blessings to babies in particular. Pope Francis certainly having a particular bias towards the children, given even those famous moments where I remember a child, as the Pope was giving one of his many sermons, ran up to him, and whilst everybody else went red in the face, embarrassed by what had taken place, the Pope reached down to embrace that child, and I think allowed the child to even sit on his chair, which is, of course, completely unheard of, given just how sacred many people believe that seat actually is. Of course, there's going to be real questions as we take in these live visuals from the Vatican about what happens next. And it's a dramatic affair, for lack of a better term, where we know that many cardinals are going to be involved in a conclave, which involves a very unique process that unfolds. And in fact, it's a process really steeped in history, culminating in what we anticipate to be, I think it's white smoke that ultimately then emerges from the Vatican, which is a signal to the world that a successor to St. Peter, as the many Catholics believe, has been chosen. But there's going to be a lot of steps before that. And one of them is a papal funeral, which traditionally takes place and is quite an elaborate affair. And I wonder how it's going to unfold now, given Pope Francis's emphasis on humility. I mean, this is a Pope who, as I mentioned a short while ago, had opted to just stay in a very simple apartment when he still could. Even after being elected Pope, he opted to cook his own meals, which again is quite different, for lack of a better term. But in the past, in fact, previous pontiffs were buried in 3 nested coffins made of cypress, lead, and oak. Pope Francis, we imagine, would probably have opted for a much simpler coffin. In fact, reports already emerging that he's already expressed that he wanted to be buried in a wooden coffin that was lined with zinc, a stark contrast if you consider just how many other popes were buried. He's also scrapped the tradition of placing the Pope's body on a raised platform in St. Peter's Basilica for public viewing. Instead, we understand, of course, that he's opted to have mourners invited to pay their respects while his body remains inside the coffin with the lid still open. Francis, of course, was the first Pope with that name. In fact, the first Pope in more than a century who we understand may very well be buried outside the Vatican. He'll be laid to rest, we understand, in the Basilica of St. Mary Major. It's one of the 4 majors of the basilicas in Rome itself. And we'll continue, of course, getting a better understanding of what the implications are, given just how differently Pope Francis went about doing his work, and just how unconventional he was, in fact, in the ways in which he conducted his papacy. But as you can imagine, there is also going to be a moment of mourning, a mourning period which we understand will last for about 9 days or so. In fact, Italy itself, we understand, may very well declare a national mourning period. And if you are struggling to connect the dots, of course, Rome is located inside Italy. It's a city in Italy. And the Vatican itself is, if you like, a part of Rome. So in many ways, the Vatican, which is seen as a sovereign country, is located in another country itself. And I suppose it's in that way that Italy will also be marking this moment by declaring a national day of mourning. The Pope's body at some stage will be blessed. It'll be dressed in papal vestments and exhibited at St. Peter's, as I mentioned, for public viewing. And these are live visuals there at St. Peter, with many people, I imagine, learning of the Pope's passing and arriving there in order, of course, to give their own respects and take in this moment in history. Pope Francis, as I mentioned, had already made plans for his funeral, and no surprises, many of those have been stripped down of the pomp and pageantry. As I mentioned earlier, in the past, we had popes who were buried in coffins made of lead and many other shiny material. Pope Francis has already come out to say that he wants his coffin to be wooden and to just be laced with zinc. Typically, the Pope's body is placed on an elevated platform as it lies in state for many of the faithful to come view it. Pope Francis has already come out to say that he wants none of that. He wants his coffin, I beg your pardon, to be on a ground level, so that the faithful that you are seeing on your screen will be able to simply walk towards it and view him as he lies inside the coffin, and taking in what, of course, might happen next. But if you have just joined us at 7 minutes towards 11 o'clock on this Monday morning, the big story dominating headlines around the world is that Pope Francis, the Holy Father, as is referred to by the 1.4 odd billion Catholics around the world, has passed away at his residence at the age of 88. It's after a long illness, with him contracting pneumonia in the past couple of days after being admitted to Gemelli Hospital in Rome. And in fact, since then, it's certainly been a bumpy ride as the Pope tried, against all efforts, I suppose, to try and make a full recovery. But what might take many people by surprise is that just less than 24 hours ago, the Pope was spotted on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And these are live visuals of that square where he was seen greeting many of the faithful who had gathered there. And he shared with them what we now understand to be his very last message, where he said, I quote, "My dear brothers and sisters, happy Easter." And thereafter, of course, he had a brief procession around St. Peter's Basilica, where he interacted with many children who had been present there, and offered his blessings. The Vatican saying that he passed away at around 25 to 8 this morning. The Bishop of Rome, as he's referred to, the Vatican going on to say that he's now returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. In the statement, the Vatican going on to say that Pope Francis has taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and most marginalized. With immense gratitude, goes on the statement from the Vatican, for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and triune God. And as I mentioned, of course, what's going to happen moving forward is a moment of mourning. 9 days or so, we're told. Thereafter, we're expecting quite an elaborate funeral that's going to be planned, which is likely going to accommodate even several heads of state who will gather there without a doubt in St. Peter's to mark this moment.